sponsored by Gear Up Alabama. My name is Dr. Gary O. White, and I am part one of two-part of the White Bass Livecast. We are excited once again to keep this bus rolling. As you all know, with Gear Up Alabama, during this particular period, we tend to, before COVID, we would travel to these different regions, providing a history tour as well as providing information about the community, all centered around creating a better understanding of the educational values, of the cultural values of the community, all with the fundamental goal of creating an opportunity of instilling pride, community pride, history pride, as well as motivating our young people and creating a sense of desire to go to college or trade or technical school. Well, this round of the Black Belt Tour, we have once again our historian, Doug Evans III, who is going to cover what we refer to as regions 2 and 3 of the Black Belt. And so I'm excited to bring Mr. Evans forward to provide this historical context. But before we do that, let us take the moment to introduce the other part of the White Bass Livecast, clinical psychologist, Dr. Christopher Bass, who will also then introduce our leader, Dr. Samantha Briggs.
How about that, everybody? I'm excited again to be here. It's always a wonderful opportunity to jump on this bus because this bus has legs. And these legs that I'm talking about, it goes beyond just a discussion today on region 2 and 3. These legs can permeate and move throughout time. So we're going to take a tour and we're going to take a trip back in time. And Professor Evans is going to bring us from back then all the way to today, and he's going to take us into tomorrow. So I'm equally as excited to be here today. And it could not be done without our fearless leader, Dr. Samantha Elliott Briggs. Dr. Briggs.
Well, hello. Welcome all the way from Birmingham, Alabama. We are excited to be here with the fellas on another Thursday, rolling. You know, we need the Tina Turner. Come on, y'all. Rolling. Roll. You're on mute, and I'm probably glad that you're on mute.
No, I like that. We need something.
Okay,
I like that.
Roll. After this, we rolling on the river. After this, we
gotta roll
in here. So, or another way you could do it too is like a train, you know, and given the fact that we have a high value of being alpha males, and so perhaps this train should be considered an alpha train. I don't know. I'm just trying to put these pieces together. But go ahead, Dr. Briggs.
Hey, look, we are excited to be together again, and we're excited to visit regions 2 and 3. So we are going to take a journey to Montgomery County. We're going to take a journey over to Lowndes County, right on down the road. And, you know, you guys are in for a treat as always. So be sure to post your questions and comments in the chat. And we'll pause periodically throughout this trip to let Professor Evans know what we're talking about. And hey, I'm excited. I'm here to learn today. So what you got, Professor Evans?
Thank you, Dr. Briggs. And I just want to thank Dr. Bass for that layup shot. We were getting back one of my favorite movies, Back to the Future. And, you know, you get in the DeLorean and you come out and you might be in 1955. And so, you know, Lowndes County, as we start this Gear Up virtual tour today, I want to invite all of the students down there in our Black Belt areas, in our schools there, to come on and take a little Back to the Future trip with us. It's so interesting, Dr. Briggs, because Lowndes is in the middle. You know, it's in the middle of Selma and Montgomery. And so there's so much rich history in between those three areas. And so we want to just start with Lowndes County. As I boot up my screen here. And again, Dr. White, as you see on the front page there, we have the marker that references the first White House of the Confederacy. And of course, this is before there was a Civil War. And so in the South, you had a leader by the name of Jefferson Davis, and this was his home. And so you could look at Montgomery County and Lowndes County as one of the bastions of the Confederacy.
Wait a minute. Hold on. So I want to make sure I get this right because I've heard that name, Mr. Evans. So when you move this to SlideShare to put it on the actual slideshow, I want to make sure I can get a really good look at that marker that you have there. So when you go up there for slideshow and play the slideshow, I want to take a closer look at that because this is amazingly of amazing interest to me. So let's hit that from the beginning and let's roll.
Yes, and you can kind of see it. Can you see that marker really clear? And for those of you all who are just vacationing in the Alabama area, or for those of you all who live in the area but haven't come by this marker, this was the beginning of the America divide from the Confederacy and the northern states. And so, yes, this was the home of Jefferson Davis. And so, Dr. Briggs, I want to just mention a few of the schools in these two counties. We have to pay homage to these schools that we've had a chance to visit in 2018. Some of these schools are just great institutions that we did have a chance to visit. One of our Let Us Make Man brothers, Kenny Walker, who taught there in the school system, always brags about LUMM High School. And so we just want to give a shout out to Lovelace Academy Magnet Program. We want to give a shout out to Booker T. Washington Magnet, Brubaker Technology School, Carver High School, Jefferson Davis High School, Robert E. Lee High School, Lanier High School, and Path Crossing High School. They're in those two counties. And so we see at the caption underneath, Dr. White, Lowndes County was a place to grow cotton. So many of these educational institutions, were in the Black Belt because of cotton. And so I asked the question today, Dr. Briggs, raise your hand if you're wearing cotton today. And it's almost impossible, right, to get dressed for work without putting on something that comes from cotton. And so, we hear two things about Lowndes County. One was that it was bloody Lowndes, and the other is that it is a place where cotton thrived.
Now, Professor Evans, I have a quick question. I'm noticing some of the names, Jefferson Davis and General Lee. These are, again, throwbacks from those past Confederate generals, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, Dr. Bass, and it's so interesting as we get to the end of the history to the tour. We're going to talk about those two schools specifically and what happened with some of our youth activism in Alabama with reference to those two schools. But when you hear the name Robert E. Lee, he was the biggest general, that you always would hear about in history. My favorite show, Dr. Briggs, growing up was the Dukes of Hazzard.
Dukes of Hazzard.
And, you would see the General Lee with the Dixie flag on top of the car. And, we had the toys. And so Robert E. Lee was the premier general at that time for the Confederacy. And again, we mentioned Jefferson Davis being one of the first, presidents there as the Civil War was coming to fruition. And so as we look at this particular slide, I mentioned to Dr. Briggs when we were talking about the voter suppression in the Black Belt, we talked about some of the what became the chain gangs. And so you could be standing on the corner and a vagrant, or you could be enslaved, and after slavery, going into post-slavery, you were put in a institutionalized version of slavery in the form of chain gangs. And so we see the book, for those of you all who may be able to get your hands on this book by James Sellers, Slavery in Alabama. To the left of that, you see a caption of what happened in Dallas County, where they were referring to runaway slaves. And so this great history has been captured so well documented in Alabama, from slavery through lynching through post-slavery. Again, we see the name Bloody Lowndes in 1966, and there's a great book, Dr. Briggs, by a professor of history at Ohio State University, Hassan Kwame Jeffries. He wrote a great book entitled Bloody Lowndes County. And so you might wonder, Dr. White, why was it called Bloody Lowndes? Of course, we could make the case that there were so much retaliation to the registered voters there in Lowndes. There was a lot of lynchings that took place in the Lowndes area. But over time, this Bloody Lowndes County just stuck. But why 1966, Dr. Briggs? And we're going to talk about what happened in 1965 and some of the sharecroppers post-slavery that were run out of the land as being sharecroppers, and why it was in 1966 because of the 1965 Voter Rights Act. Trying to go back to the main screen.
Oh, the slideshow. Hit slideshow at the top, to the right. No, at the top, your menu bar is at the cross. There we go. And then hit from current slide. There we go.
Okay. All right, back to our regular scheduled program. Now, Letterhatchie, there were many lynchings at this time, Dr. White, but Letterhatchie had a marketplace there by the Equal Justice Initiative. And, you know, of course, you and I remember Jared Grant and when we were down there in, I think, 2018 at the museum, and I'm still get teary-eyed when I talk to my son about it and when I talk to my wife about it. But when we look at the jars of the Cross family, Dr. Briggs, and we see the jar there of Jim Cross, which depicts the actual soil that was taken from the lynching site. Or when we look up and we look at the old black and white photo of Elmore Bowling. And, you know, you always heard these stories told when his son was interviewed, Dr. Bass, Mr. Bowling's son was interviewed about the lynching, and the FBI interviewed him, and he asked the FBI, you know, why was my father lynched? And the FBI said, well, it's not the reason that they said, that he was rude to a white woman. And he told Mr. Bowling's son that at that time, there were so many lynchings throughout the Black Belt region because, of course, we know, Dr. Briggs, that the Black Belt stretched all the way from Virginia to Texas. And it just came through Alabama, but it stretched from Virginia to Texas. And so one of the things that we saw common at this time was lynchings in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And that was normally the MO that was put out there, that someone was rude or disrespectful to a white woman. But the FBI told him, no, it was more than likely because Mr. Elmore Bowling was well-to-do. You know, and that term that we would hear, Dr. Bass, would be the uppity Negro. And he was financially well off. He was a truck driver. He was a farmer. He had 3 or 4 streams of income. And so in that county, if you were poorer than Mr. Elmore, you might have felt some kind of way. And so that's what led to the lynching of Mr. Elmore. And ironically, Dr. Bass, that was in 1947. And so when we look at a lynching in 1947 of a well-to-do black man, we think in terms of always being around the 20s and around that turn of the century. Mr. Cross, however, was in 1900. He was mad. You know, he heard about a black man being lynched. We never got his name. He heard about a black man being lynched in Letterhatchie for, again, being disrespectful. And upon that lynching of a black man in that small town near in Lowndes, we see that Mr. Jim Cross was vocal about it, and his anger and him being vocal about it got back to the residents there in Lowndes, and they showed up at his house. And what they did, Dr. Briggs, they came to the house, knocked on the door, and shot Jim Cross right there in the door. And so he has a family at home. They're at home, they hear the gunshots, they don't know what to do. And so this mob, this activism mob from Lowndes, after shooting Jim Cross in the door threshold, they go in the house, Dr. Bass, and then they proceed to shoot his wife. They proceed to shoot his son and to shoot his daughter. And so there was a lynching by gunshot of 4 people at one time. And that's why when you see the initial picture, you see the 4 jars there. And that was in 1900. And again, there were about, I believe, there were a handful of lynchings that year, and then there were some that picked up in 1917. Incidentally, with 1917, going into 1918, not just in the Black Belt area, Dr. Briggs, but we saw in 1918 mass violence taking place all throughout the South and the North, and it became known as the Red Summers. But nobody ever thinks to ask the clinical question, Dr. Bass, well, what was going on in 1918 and 1919 to create so much violence all throughout the Black Belt region, all the way up to New York? Well, in 1918, right before the Red Summers, was the Spanish flu. And so people were what, Dr. Briggs? Stuck in the house, experiencing economic, financial downheaval. So being stuck in the house, you're clinically depressed, I would assume, Dr. Bass. Financially, you can't go out and farm and attend to your crops, and you can't get your streams of income like you did before the Spanish flu, and you did not have the medicines in place in 1918. There's a famous picture, Dr. White, of the Georgia Tech football game, where everyone is at the Georgia Tech football game during the Spanish flu with masks on in 1918. And so we also saw what, Dr. Briggs, after that Spanish flu epidemic began to get better, we saw police brutality and lynchings all throughout the Black Belt area. And we wonder in 1918 if what we saw then is symbolic of the police brutality that we've seen through this epidemic in the pandemic since COVID has hit, in the South and all the way up to the North. So just a parallel in time from 100 years. Again, we said, get on this Back to the Future bus ride.
One of the things that's interesting, Mr. Evans, is that I think about the song written by someone named Abel Meerpool out of New York, Bronx, who was disturbed by the amount of lynchings that he had witnessed. It troubled him so much that he wrote a poem called Strange Fruit. And when he wrote that poem called Strange Fruit, and that poem, he then shared it with a store owner, in terms of a bar store owner who had many musicians who he happened to know Billie Holiday. And so he passed that song on, Strange Fruit, to Billie Holiday, which of course now becomes known all over the world. And so every time you talk about these lynchings and how common they were, it moves me to think about the song by certainly by Billie Holiday. But go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. White. That was powerful. That's one of my mother's favorite artists when she was alive. So as we see, Dr. Briggs, we see a map, a laid out map of Lowndes County, and we see right there underneath the word Lowndes, we see Lettahatchee. And so again, it's a small unincorporated city, or we would call a town, where many of these lynchings took place. And why was it such a densely populated area? Well, it was because of cotton. And so you had, at the end of slavery, you had these sharecroppers and farmers still working the land because that's what they knew, Dr. Bass. And so when Booker T. Washington came and talked about the Atlanta Compromise in 1895, he was talking about towns like Lettahatchee. He was talking about cast down your buckets where you are, because there was no Samantha Briggs at that time in a gear up Alabama. And so the agricultural agrarian society, that's what it was, at that time. And so we see a picture, and there's so many heroes, Dr. Briggs, of this area, from Rosa Parks to Dr. King to Ralph David Abernathy and so many others, Reverend Shuttlesworth. But there's so many who we'll never know their names. And so when we go to museums in Birmingham and we see that they have an exhibit to the foot soldiers whose names we don't know, And when we look to the right of the photo and we see the unknown slave woman who we don't know what life must have been like. And then when we look to the left, we have Uncle Alf. Uncle Alf Cottrell, Dr. Bass, was the person just taking care of his master's horses. But what got me most about Uncle Alf, Dr. White, was his feet. And if you look at it, Uncle Alf's feet, it tells me, Dr. Briggs, he didn't have no Timberland boots. He didn't have any Air Force Ones or Jordans at that time. He was doing the labor with his bare hands and probably oftentimes without shoes that fit properly. And so just 1,000 words of looking at Uncle Alf having a moment of himself sitting in that chair tells me a lot about what life must have been like in Lowndes County.
Professor Evans, can I ask you a question before you go into the 60s?
Yes.
I have actually two questions, or a question and then a statement. Well, the statement first. They say that the average person after Reconstruction, the average slave didn't move but more than 50 miles from the plantation to, where they resided. And we know that based on that whole concept, based on the Equal Justice Institute, they suggested that many of those traumas from slavery, if they stayed in the same region, there was still that significant trauma that played itself out over and over, that psychological trauma that played itself out over and over. So I can only assume that it began to permeate in decisions that were being made, how youngsters were being raised, also what was taught in the schools. Wow. So I'm really interested in how that psychological stench of slavery continued to fester, even in today's time. So wow. I'm really curious about that.
Dr. Bass, that's powerful. And it's a perfect segue as we go into the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, because there was no registered voters. And from an 80% population in Lowndes County, you had 0 registered voters in 1955. 0. And so again, it tells me that, to your point, that indoctrination of fear, it was not only psychological, but it was real because of what we saw and why we would call it a bloody Lowndes. And so that those fear tactics of voter suppression, or the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan rioting, or the Citizens Council, Dr. Bass, where the Democratic Party, that today would not be considered the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party of the 1940s and 50s had as its symbol a rooster, that on top of the rooster it said white supremacy. That was the official logo of the Democratic Party. So if I wanted to stay in my place, it might be best to keep from getting run out of town. And we're going to circle back and talk about the economic implications of that, Dr. Bass, and how that also played into that trauma. And Dr. White always talks in his Restoring the Black Family. He talks about the shows like Good Times and the Jeffersons, and how this great migration from places like Alabama and Mississippi ended up in Chicago and Detroit, and how some of the second and third generations were saying, we can't live here. And so you saw this great migration going up north. But so that's a really great question, Dr. Bass, on generations of psychological trauma that impacted on those generations there.
So what's amazing, as you go to pull that next slide up, every time we talk about voter suppression in that regard, and then we parallel it with today. So I'm excited to hear this ongoing, certainly dialogue around the impact or the absence of voting in this particular period of time. Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
Dr. White, that's a great video with this person, this statuesque gentleman in the left of our screen, Stokely Carmichael, but at the time, he became later on Kwame Ture. I would like you to play that, Dr. White, just a short clip.
Okay, good. Can I have you stop sharing so I can share?
Yes, sir. I will do that right now.
Thank you. So, when we take an opportunity, let's listen in to Stokely Carmichael himself bringing this issue of voter suppression to the forefront.
It says majority rules. We are 80% of the majority in this. We are 80% in this county, and we have the right to rule this county. We have the right to rule this county, and we're going to rule it. I don't care how poor we are and how black we are, we're going to govern this county. Stokely Carmichael and Colton Cox and others who got together and told us, according to the Alabama law, if we didn't like what the Democratic Party was doing in our county or the Republican Party, we could form our own political organization and it could become a political party.
That's good right there. Thank you, Dr. White.
No problem. So as you move, that Stokely Carmichael also became known as Kwame Ture, bringing that as an issue in Lowndes County. Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
So, Dr. Briggs, Dr. White always brags about, two things, being from the Bay Area. He brags about his Oakland Raiders, well, the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay. And he brags about the rich history of the Black Panther Party. And I love that because when we were in Alabama, we were reminded that Oakland is not the historical place for football. We were reminded that Alabama is where football reigns. We were reminded about the Auburn and, the Alabama Crimson Tide. But we were also reminded about the first symbol of the Black Panther. And of course, it wasn't the Black Panther Party of Oakland, California, that we've all known through history, that did so many great things during the Civil Rights Movement. But the actual Black Panther emblem that Huey P. Newton had to go and ask, and Bobby Seale had to ask the citizens of Lowndes, the organizers of Lowndes, hey man, I like that emblem, man. We want to use that here in California. So I would be remiss, Dr. Bass, if I didn't just remind Dr. White about the Black Panther of Lowndes County. So one of the interesting things about the NACP there in Lowndes County was that in Alabama, Dr. Briggs, the NACP was run out in 1956. And I've never heard of a law like this, Dr. Bass, where you could not service the community because they, for whatever reason, Alabama state said, we don't want you here, NACP. And so this created an opportunity for other grassroots organizations to come to the scene here. And we see the organizing of this Lowndes County movement. And so you see Dr. Bass to the right of that picture, this big rooster. And then you see to the left, this Black Panther. So Dr. Bass, why did they pick the Black Panther? Well, initially, there was some church lady, Dr. White, that probably was a deaconess in the church, and they were trying to find an emblem for the Democratic Party. And she said, oh, I got it. The white dove. And everybody's like, no. And, of course, the white dove is this beautiful symbol, this biblical symbol. And they said, no, it doesn't depict our struggle here in Lowndes County. It may depict somebody else's town, but in Lowndes, that dove, I don't see beating up no rooster. But what animal do we know from being rural people in the county? We see these alley cats, these Black Panthers that don't mess with people until you mess with them. And so this Black Panther became a symbol because it was known to be an animal that kept to itself. But if you back the Black Panther in the corner, Dr. Bass, they would come out fighting.
It's a shame that they didn't have the white bass. That would have killed that rooster for sure.
The white bass. And so we go back to Stokely Carmichael being in Lowndes County for about a year, Dr. White, and he was organizing with SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee there. And SNCC was initially taking a back seat to the SCLC, but the SCLC wasn't getting a lot done in Lowndes, if anything. So you got no NACP, you've got no SCLC presence, and so you've got SNCC going from door to door, much like we see today when my phone is getting calls about Ossoff and Pastor Warnock running for Senate. You saw this done in 1956 with Stokely Carmichael organizing there. And what they realized was if we make 80% of the population and 0% of the voters, we're going to have to get registered voters. But what we're going to have to do is create our own independent political party. And so, Dr. Bass, you're telling me in 1956, they had the vision to create a Black political party and call it the Lowndes County Freedom Organization with its symbol, the Black Panther. And because we've already said, Dr. Briggs, there were so many that could not read or weren't reading, at a certain level in the county, that if you couldn't read, you knew your political emblem was that Black Panther. And so you could identify with the Black Panther and vote that Black slate of candidates there in Lowndes County. And so on May 3rd, 1966, Dr. Bass, after 10 years of organizing, we get up to 1966 and we finally have our first Blacks voting in an election, because it took time to get all these African Americans registered to vote. So it was May 3rd, 1966 was the first time since Reconstruction that we've had African Americans in Lowndes County voting in a major election since Reconstruction. Now this, Dr. Briggs, brought me to tears. We know Gary and I, Dr. White and I know a person that runs the homeless program here in the city of Atlanta. And so when I was researching the economic terrorism that took place, Dr. Bass, when Stokely Carmichael and others was going door to door through the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, this is a 23-year-old man showing up at your house with no fear. But you living there all those years, Dr. White, you had a little fear because you've seen what's happened in the, to your friends and your neighbors and your church members. And so one of the things that could have happened was the same thing that we saw in Lettahachie Town, basically lynching could have happened. But another thing that we saw, Dr. Briggs, was the economic revolt that took place with rural white farmers running their sharecroppers off their land because they got registered to vote by SNCC. And because they signed their name to get registered, those white farmers didn't want that mess in their town. And so they said, you can't not live here or farm this land any longer. And so not only was it their stream of income, Dr. White, but it was also their residence. And so it created a town, Dr. Bass, tent city, displaced homeless folk that wanted to be registered to vote in Lowndes were now kicked off the land and had to basically sleep out as urban campers. And it created this tent city town. And so you ask yourself, how resilient were those African Americans in Lowndes? Well, I'm scared to register to vote. I'm scared what may happen if I vote, but I'm going to do it anyway. And then I get run off my land that I've been farming for years, and I'm still not going to be shaken. I'm going to form now what we would call today as a tent city. And so I got to tell you, Dr. Bass, when reading about this refuge of tent city, it kind of brought me to tears, because some of it was economic, but some of it was also because of violence that took place there in Lowndes County.
This is absolutely amazing as you kind of move to pull that back up, that again, I keep moving ourselves to 2020, and I keep finding myself thinking about the culture and the voting from 2008 under Barack Obama to now 2020 in the Biden vote. Both are historical, both reflect a presence of youth and a presence of community engagement. I know when we were tracking the voting patterns and we were watching the votes come in, and then ultimately when that was done, Dr. Briggs, I remember when you put a map up that showed where blue, though unlike Georgia, though Alabama did not turn blue, but what was very clear is that the same focus that Gear Up Alabama has in terms of the Black Belt that ran across the state, then we saw when that map was superimposed, we saw the exact same thing in Alabama. We saw across the state the same black belt route, which is where people vote. The majority of the people in Alabama voted for Biden. So, regardless of your political affiliation, that pattern that we saw speaks to where we've gotten to, as Mr. Evans, as you prepare to pull your next slide up, where we've gotten to from this historical standpoint, and having the opportunity to take a look at these images and certainly how they have moved across time in that regard. So this is definitely what we see as a history making phenomenon that's right here before us. That same pattern that you're looking at, we see that exact same thing happen with our voters. And we're talking about a population, and I know I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but it kind of makes me a little excited because we're looking at a young population that's certainly engaged in the voting that took place in the state. So, you have 72% of the population in Lowndes County have high school diplomas. And so we see these populations and these groups that are certainly involved from a voting standpoint. Mr. Evans, turn it back to you.
And that's why when
Can I say,
Dr. Briggs showed those two maps side by side, it just really blew me away, Dr. White, because it goes back to what Stokely Carmichael was talking about. If we're 80% of the population, but the 20% is the ruling class politically, it makes no sense when you look at all of those counties in the Black Belt, particularly, as Dr. Bass said, descendants of slaves, descendants of sharecroppers who really didn't move far away. They did not move far away. And in some cases, they did not have great education, but they all stayed in the land, working that area, living in that area, but had no power politically.
so Professor Evans, what I'm hearing is that there's not just a legacy of slavery, there's also a legacy of activism. And then therefore what we've seen when we traveled around from schools in this region, a legacy of resilience, because these students were superior.
Yes.
I remember talking to one young man who just talked about his dreams and his goals, and his name escapes me right now, but he said, you know what, I'm going to be successful. I don't care. And I think about that young man all the time, because it's like, regardless of what's around me, as Dr. White talked about a second ago with, only being 20%, despite what's around me, I have enough fortitude that I'm going to make it and I'm going to thrive. So hats off to you, young man. I pray that you're watching right now. I could see your face. I just can't call your name.
And to many young men and young women like him that we have, run into when we're on those actual tours down in the Black Belt counties, we just want to now ask you all to come again back to the future. Come again on this virtual tour as we're weaving into Montgomery County. And we look at the map there, and as you see it to your right, Dr. Bass, there's Montgomery County right there next to Lowndes. And so we're going to go a little bit east to Montgomery County. We see the marker. We know that, that they've all had their history of slavery there. And you see the warehouses used in the slave trade, and all of this great African-American resource has basically emanated from that. And this is something that I just thought was so fascinating, Dr. Briggs, because, a lot of times people are coming in for family reunions, or they're coming in for a Magic City Classic here and there, or, they're coming in to go on a college tour with their children. And sometimes they just don't have the time to do a lot of sightseeing while they're there. But if you're ever in the Montgomery area and you are going to visit Alabama State, and you're right there in the heart of Montgomery, I encourage you, if you're in town, to visit one of these famous sites. To the left, we see Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And many of us know that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., pretty much cut his teeth there at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. We know that we see the marker next to it, but also the King Home Parsonage. And what blew me away about it, Dr. Briggs, is when you're reading the history of Alabama, the people are just so dynamic when you think about how they it's a normalized to be terrorized and have the King home bombed 3 times. Or they'll say, you know, yeah, the Dr. King home was bombed a few times, like it's, you know, no big deal. But this domestic terrorism was a way of life from the 50s and the 60s there in Montgomery. And of course, we looked next to the picture of the King parsonage, we see the Rosa Parks Museum. And you know, when I was last there, I believe with Dr. White in Montgomery, Dr. Briggs, we got a chance to go and look at the King Home Parsonage, and we got a chance to see the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and it didn't take long. Everything was so close right there. And so I urge you all out there watching that if you're ever in Montgomery, that you just take the time to go visit these historic sites.
And let me just add to that, you know, even in COVID, you know, there's so many virtual resources now. You know, we have really found ourselves in a time where, you know, even the smallest of the museums are putting forth an effort to create some type of online virtual journey. And so, you know, this is the perfect time really to, you know, not only have electronic field trips, as we call it in K-12 for the students, but it's also an opportunity for you to map out your future field trips. In the state of Alabama, I don't know about in Georgia, in the state of Alabama, we have to do the 4th grade history project. You know, so to my educators who are watching us right now, you don't have to physically go in, you know, to these venues in order to accomplish the 4th grade history project. You know, Professor White and Dr. Bass and yeah, I mixed that all up, but you know what I mean, Evans, Bass, White. We keep talking about the lack that our children are going to have when they return to the classroom next year. It doesn't have to be that. You know, how can we continue to maximize on the resources that we have at our disposal to keep the education going? Because for some of you, you know, you might be watching. I see that Dr. White is tagging family in the Bay Area. You know, I know that y'all are tagging people in Atlanta. I know that, you know, I have folks, you know, from back home in St. Louis who might be watching right now. You can bring your children on, or your students even, on an exploration of the Civil Rights Trail virtually.
Wow.
You know, whether it's replaying a video like this or, you know, going out to some of the resources I'm putting in the chat, go check it out, because the history is rich and it's ours. And in order to not repeat certain things, we need to be aware of the who, what, when, why, and where now.
I've gotten to the point where I have a great appreciation. When you study history, it literally puts contemporary times in context. That's really the true nature of history. It helps you understand from whence you come, and it also gives some insight in the direction or the trajectory of yourself as an individual, for your family, as well as your community. So even when we talk, as Doug is moving through the Montgomery community, here's what we know. According to the 2019 census, we're seeing in terms of education that 86.7% of the population here, it says, have a high school graduates or higher. 33% we're looking at have bachelor's degrees. So we see not only is voting critical, we also see in this county, we also see that there's a great deal of value toward education. So this work and what Mr. Evans is doing as a historian, he's putting from whence we come in context, again, to better understand our trajectory. And I'm going to say this as a professor, because myself, Dr. Briggs, Dr. Bass, we're professors. Here's what I'm going to tell all my freshmen in a college and all of our high school seniors. Your paper becomes substantially enriched when you are able to bring the history to life in any paper that you write. You have to put the story that you're telling in context. So that's what this Black Belt History Tour is about, putting it in context. And so in that regard, I'm gonna shut up, Mr. Evans, so you can continue to put this in context.
So we see, Dr. White, the Montgomery Improvement Association. And you know, Dr. Briggs, you know, we talk about Christmas addicts. You know, we talk about the the alarm going off, which started the American Revolution, when Crispus Attucks ran into some of those red coats and they got into it, you know, and the shot heard around the world. We know the story, Dr. Baz. And Crispus Attucks is always given credit for being the impetus behind the American Revolution, even though we know that there was so much going on from the Boston Tea Party into so many things that played into the American Revolution. And I gotta say that about our beloved Rosa Parks. You know, she's basically referenced as the Crispus Attucks of the civil rights movement. And so what better place for her to be than in the Montgomery community when this starts. And so we know about December 1st, 1955, when this beautiful woman of about 42 years old, you know, this seamstress, this secretary of the NAACP who got married, Dr. White, at 19 years old, and her husband introduced her to the NAACP. And so we know that she was the husband of Raymond Parks. And so what better person to set it off, so to speak, than Miss Rosa, who worked all day when she got on that bus. And, you know, I teach my boys, Dr. Baz, if you see a sister, a grandmama, a great-grandmama, a little girl that needs a seat, and we're on the train, we're on the bus, we're at the McDonald's, well, man, get up and let her sit down. I remember being, I was in Africa, and I was like jumping to get up, because this is something that we should pass on to our sons, Dr. Baz, because women gave us life. Nothing more simple than that. And so for Miss Parks to be asked, Dr. Briggs, to give up her seat for a man, you know, obviously a white man, but to give up her seat for a man after her feet was hurting, December 1st, 1955, she wasn't feeling it. And so we know that she got fined $14 for this infraction, Dr. Briggs. And so when we do our calculation, $14 in 1955, it's about $135. Now, that would have hurt me right around Christmas time, Dr. Bass. I don't know about you, but for not giving up my seat for a man, it just baffles my mind in 1955. So it led to the creation of the Montgomery Improvement Association. And so we all know about Dr. King. We all know about Rosa Parks, but we seldom hear about MIA or MIA or the Montgomery Improvement Association and who was the person behind it. And so that we know Dr. King was a drum major of justice, Dr. Briggs, sometimes we forget about who the band director was. And so before we get to the band director, we have to set the stage, Dr. Baz, because you can't have a great activism community without having a great college in the community. And so when you have civil rights in Atlanta, it's no mistake that there's a Clark Atlanta, that there was an AU at that time, or a Morehouse or Spelman or Morris Brown. And so when you have civil rights in a Montgomery, it's no mistaking that we have being founded in 1867, this great institution. And I think about Alabama State, Dr. Briggs, it was founded on November 13th, 1867, but not as Alabama State and not in Montgomery. It was founded in Marion, Alabama as the Lincoln Normal School of Marion. And again, we know so many of our schools at that time were to teach the teachers. And so what better, thing to have than the Lincoln Normal School of Marion. And so it became Alabama State University and relocated to Montgomery. It has about 31 bachelor degrees. Of course, the ratio there, at least in 2018, was about 20-1. So about, 20 students to one professor. But what's so great about this institution, so many things come to mind, Dr. Briggs, but we see a picture to the right of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, a great alum of Alabama State University. So you might ask, Dr. White, who were other, great alums? Well, Ralph David Abernathy, the right hand to Dr. King, was an alum of Alabama State University. But, we can even bring it up to contemporary times. We see Ricky Smiley. But for those of you out there watching, 2 Chainz was another product of Alabama State University. And so what's so interesting as we look at one of the original pictures of the land Dr. Bass, you know, I want you to think about many of your students, Dr. Bass, that you have influenced there at Clark Atlanta. And so I gotta show you this next slide because we always talk about Greensboro, North Carolina. And you know, Dr. White, my wife is from, she went to Bennett. And so she's always bragging, you know, about the sit-ins at Greensboro, you know. I said, okay, y'all set it off in Greensboro. But we can't forget about what they did in Alabama at Alabama State University when those 9 students had sit-ins. And so as we bring it back up, we see one of the oldest pictures of Alabama State. We bring it up to the civil rights time of 1960. And Dr. Briggs, they just celebrated their 60th reunion for those ASU 9 who purposely went to the state capitol, Dr. White, because state capitol's in Montgomery. And so they went to the state capitol and they sat in on the cafeteria and said, no, we're not leaving. Y'all gonna feed us. And so we'd be remiss if we didn't give a shout out to the ASU 9 from February 25th, 1960. And so when we put it in perspective of a timeline, of course, we know the NAACP in 1909. We know that the Board versus Brown of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, 1954. But there was another case in Alabama that doesn't get the credit, Dr. Briggs, for putting a nail in the coffin of Plessy versus Ferguson. We know in 1955, December 1, when Miss Rosa Parks sat down, and it set things in motion. But you can watch any interview of attorney Fred Gray, and he'll tell you it wasn't the Rosa Parks case that set it in motion, even though he was the attorney for Miss Rosa Parks. And we see the state troopers in front of the Capitol. We see one of the young ladies they refer to as a general there that would help prepare the food and get the organizers together there in Montgomery. Well, what set it in motion then, Dr. White? It was a young lady named Claudette Colvin. And so, yeah, we know about December 1, 1955. But what we don't know about, Dr. Bass, is March of 1955, 6 months before Rosa Parks sat down on that bus. 6 months before she sat on that bus and got notoriety all in the country, Miss Colvin sat down on that bus and her feet was hurting too. And she was asked to get up. And once again, we see none other than attorney Fred Gray coming to her aid. Now, interesting about the $14, Dr. Briggs, that became $135 in 2020, Miss Colvin wasn't charged with the city ordinance of not getting up on that bus. Now, in the police world, Dr. White, we would call this charge peed off the police. She was charged with disorderly conduct. And Miss Colvin was about that life, Dr. Bass. They had to drag her off of that bus. And so again, by her being 15 years old, she wasn't necessarily the fit for setting it off, like setting the revolution off like Rosa Parks became. And so
why was she not the, why would you say she was not the fit?
Well, I just think that because Rosa Parks was so well trained, she was an NAACP secretary, she was sent out to do training workshops throughout the country. And so when you think about the Greensboro sit-ins, where if we would go to a recreation of it, Dr. White, we would have people spitting in our face, calling us the N-word, threatening us with violence, sometimes putting hands on us. Some of us ain't built for that. But Miss Parks was well trained to do that. You know, she was well trained to sit back and have the patience to not respond to those attacks. Whereas Miss Colvin, Miss Claudette, she was a little different. She was 15 years old and she was about that life. Anytime she was interviewed, Dr. Bass, she said she had 2 things in her head when they asked her to get off that bus. She had Harriet Tubman on one shoulder and she had Sergeant of Troop on the other shoulder. And neither one of them females was about that nonviolent movement. So I just think to set it in motion throughout the country. I think that in retrospect, Rosa Parks may have been the better fit. She had the NAACP connections, and I think it was just more of a strategic move. But we're going to get to the other women, Dr. White, because Claudette Colvin wasn't the only one.
So I want to talk about strategy for a quick sec. And I want to talk about you men and what y'all consider to be strategy. And I hope, my Morehouse brother, that it will come out as you move forward, because you've already, checked us on, being patient. But I want to see if it's going to come forward about women in the movement.
Okay.
Because we played a role.
Yes.
But oftentimes, that role was pushed to the side.
Yes. Yes.
And it was very strategic to put in the spotlight those people who we thought could hold attention, those people who we thought could stand up against the man, those people we thought, could articulate our goals and objectives best, those people who were going to be the legacy in the history book, because we knew it was going to be a history lesson. And so we always were strategic in who had the spotlight and who had the microphone. And more frequently than not, the only women who got it were women who could be, I don't want to say trained because that sounds horrible, but those who could be prepared and those who already had a national spotlight.
Dr. Briggs, you
don't let the women's studies on the doctor come out.
Yes, sir. Dr. Briggs, you make a brilliant point. I'm so glad you checked me on that point, because it brings to mind an organization that never got the credit. When we talked about the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, we're going to go back and talk about Ed Nixon. Okay, we're going to talk about Reverend Abernathy, but we don't talk about Joanne Robinson. We don't talk about the 200 women of the Black Women's Political Council that pretty much ran the MIA. And so, to your point, it was those 200 sisters in Montgomery that organized the boycotting of the buses. They're the ones that put the flyers together, because keep in mind, when Rosa Parks got arrested, the phone started ringing, and it was Ed Nixon that basically put everything in motion. And so when he put everything in motion, he's the one that called the preachers. Because to your point, Dr. Briggs, he knew that it was the preachers that would be able to get the microphone. It was the preachers who were always, until 2020, run by our mothers and our grandmothers. And so the organization took place in the church. Well, who was the church? It was the sisters in the community. And so, yes, they weren't normally on the camera, but they were the ones behind the scenes running the movement. And so I've got to give a shout out, Dr. Briggs, to Miss Joanne Robinson and those 200 women of the Women's Political Council that really was the engine behind the Montgomery Improvement Association.
And I have to give a quick shout out, since you're shouting out, C.J. Williams, who was a wonderful person who later became C.J. Bass, my mother, who was a member of the Black Panther Party in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
As you're talking, I'm looking, Kathy H. Hendricks. She on the post here, Facebook says, the penalty for success. My father was lynched in Lowndes County, Alabama, written by Josephine Boyling McCall. And so I get excited as we begin to watch everybody bring this to the forefront. And, just the challenge associated with the marginalization of Black women, and people don't like to talk about the fact that many of these sisters had to go off on these leaders whom we love and whom we often embrace. And it's an issue that exists to this day. Although, even when we look at the elections now, here's what every leading political candidate is very, very clear, that women, particularly Black women, vote as a block. And that we don't see that. So they are literally, Black women almost could form their own party as an organized block, and that we as that Black men in particular don't hold that same level of unity. We have a level of unity, but not that consistent level of unity as we see within the context of these women. Okay, Ms. Evans, concede.
One more side note before we forget. Again, for my educators out there, Little known Black history fact, I wrote the teacher's guide for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. So I just posted it in the second, one of the lessons is on the unknown women of the civil rights movement. So for you teachers who are looking for a resource, or you parents who really want to know what homeschooling is, go on over there and download some lessons and teach these babies some.
Go ahead, Chief Black History.
Go ahead, Dr. Briggs. That's just find a way or make a way, I guess. So we're at this 1955 crossroads, Dr. White. And, there's so many women that were not on the forefront for various reasons, Dr. Briggs, but we know that they were the engine behind the movement. They just chose to propel Rosa Parks in that front position. So when we see Rosa Parks, we forget that the lawsuit that really put the nail in Plessy versus Ferguson there were 4 plaintiffs. And so we will never forget Miss Claudette Colvin. We will never forget that 15-year-old teenager that sat down March 2nd, 1955, 9 months before Rosa Parks. And she was always behind the scenes. And I think she probably felt some kind of way about it, to be honest with you, Dr. Briggs, but that's how history played out. There was Miss Aurelia S. Browder, and we're gonna come back to her because she was the named plaintiff on the lawsuit. Susie McDonald, again, Claudette Colvin, and Mary Louise Smith. Those were the 4 women that really put the legal case in motion with attorney Fred Gray. It really legally wasn't Rosa Parks, but that is the way we tell that narrative every year in February for Black History Month. So we see Ed Nixon, and as we were saying, Dr. Briggs, when Rosa Parks got arrested for sitting on that bus, she was the secretary for many years of the NAACP. Well, we know that I believe Ed Nixon had been the NAACP president for about 10 years. He was even elected to be the head of the state NAACP. He was also very instrumental as an activist with the sleeping car porter. So he had his hands in everything. He came up with the MIA as well. So that was kind of, if you needed an activist to get it done, you give the microphone to Ralph David Abernathy, but behind the scenes, Ed Nixon was pulling the strings and making it happen. He would pick up the phone and get Attorney Gray involved, or he would strategize. So when you heard Dr. King, you really didn't know it was coming from Ed Nixon. Ed Nixon tells this story, Dr. Briggs, that when Rosa Parks was in jail, he called. And at that time, when African-American called the sheriff's department, you get cussed out. They tell you, go about your business. This ain't none of your business. And so he didn't get any information about Miss Parks' arrest. And I think Attorney Gray was out of town. And so he called a local white attorney there to act on the behalf of Miss Parks. And they were able to go down to find out more about her arrest. And that's when they find out the charges. So Ed Nixon gets on the phone, Dr. White, starts making the calls. First person he called, Ralph David Abernathy. Second person he called was Reverend Hubert. And they were all on board. We tired of this. After Ed Nixon said, well, we're going to have to do something about it more than being tired. We're going to boycott. It was Ed Nixon's idea, but I'm quite sure, Dr. Briggs, he had been hearing these ideas from his wife, his church members, and everyone else in that community, but he was the mouthpiece behind it. And so if Dr. White was the drum major, he was the band director. And so in 1955, the plan for the boycott began. And the third call he made, Dr. White, was a man named, very little known guy in Montgomery, named by the name of Martin Luther King. A new pastor on the scene. And Dr. Bass, he knew he didn't want to get involved. He was like, well, Ed, let me think about it. I'm gonna call you back. And it would have happened with or without Dr. King, but Dr. King probably talked to the other pastors, and he decided to jump on board with the boycott. If you weren't a big time preacher, Dr. Briggs, you were also kind of in the background, just like the ladies of the movement. But we know that Ed Nixon is the unsung father of the Montgomery bus boycott. And we want to pay homage to that as a book written by Michael Eady on that. And everyone that was at that time will give Ed Nixon credit. There wouldn't have been a successful boycott if it wasn't for the lawyer, Fred Gray. But there wouldn't have been boycott at all if it wasn't for E.D. Nixon's coming up with strategizing behind how to boycott. Now we're talking about 381 days. Now 365 days, Dr. Bass. If I told my wife we're not driving, I don't know how we getting to work. We ain't driving for 365 days. There was no Uber, Dr. Briggs. So everybody, to your point, that basically the economic engine behind the buses in Montgomery were African-American women. They were school teachers. You know, they were people who worked domestically, but they were professional women that rode that bus. So that 10 cents from the African-American community kept the Montgomery buses going. And so when they pulled back, I think the next day when they boycotted, there might have been 8 people on the bus. And sure enough, there was 100% buy-in. So what did they do, Dr. Bass? Even the taxi cab drivers reduced their rates, because wasn't no black folk taking taxis. They reduced their rates from 45 cents to 10 cents to compete with the bus 10-cent fee to say, I will take you. And what did Alabama legislature do? They passed a ruling that made it illegal for the taxi cab drivers to reduce their rates to 10 cents. So then what did we do, Dr. Briggs? We Ubered. We did a 1955 Uber. Jump on in my car, man. I got you. And so 1955, we Uber or we walked. And we did it for 381 days until we broke the back of the bus system. And as we know, Dr. Bass, money talks. And so as we think about those unsung heroes, Dr. Briggs, we have one last picture of Miss Colvin, Miss Browder, Miss McDonald, and Miss Smith.
Now, Professor Evans, I gotta say, this was, first of all, this was brilliant, because what you did was you talked again about what we sort of hit on a little earlier about the resilience of a people. You talked about how those women who were overlooked didn't get their just due. And it reminded me while you were talking about the young sister, and Dr. Briggs, help me to remember her name, the young sister who started the campaign for youth.
Tyra Robinson.
Tyra Robinson. We affectionately called her Harriet because, you know, she led a group of young people to really take it to the next level. So again, I'm seeing everything that you've done. You've tied the past to the present, and with, you know, Ms. Robinson, I can see it actually being tied to the future. So I'm excited about what you've been able to lay out for us. Dr. White, I think you had something?
No, I'm just certainly excited as I see even him bring these last slides to the close. I know we've kind of gone over our time, but Mr. Evans have been so on fire as a lover of history. He's just been so on fire here. And I'm going to say the people in Lowndes County and the people in Montgomery, you all should really feel proud as I do in terms of what this history is. Dr. Briggs was right. As he began to go, I jumped on and started sending links to my family saying, you all have got to hear this. Why? My mother's from Louisiana. So, and I got so many family from the South. And so it does me well, my heart well, to see Mr. Evans cover this. So it is my hope that certainly the level of appreciation that I feel, it certainly resonates and cross through this social media. So Mr. Evans, we'll let you close this last section out, and we'll bring it in from there.
As we close out, I was so just proud to have been with Dr. Briggs and you all in 2018 when we visited the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. And so I just encourage anyone who's in the Montgomery area to visit the museum. You see a picture of yourself, Dr. White, and Dr. and Jared Grant, Professor Grant, looking up at those stone columns of all of those representing lynched African Americans.
How many years ago was this picture?
I believe this was 2018, Dr. Briggs.
Woo, 2020 and did it.
Now, as we wrap up.
Hey, hold on.
She's wrong for that, Dr. White.
I'm sorry, everybody watching us. Go back one slide.
Oh, baby.
It's been a long year, Dr. Briggs.
You almost had an afro in that picture to go along with all them black.
Go ahead. Go.
No. And so one last, as we wrap up and as we close out, Ryan Stevenson is, he's such a hero to me, Dr. White, and the Equal Justice Initiative project started in 1989. You can see his book listed here, Just Mercy. Many of you all are familiar with the movie that was done about a year or so ago with Jamie Foxx. It's basically how he helped get a free man off of death row. And so the Equal Justice Initiative, it was just life-changing while we visited the museum there. And as I close out, Dr. Briggs, you know, Montgomery and Lowndes County was rich with the activism from voting up until the president 2020, and we still see our student activists doing the same thing. When we opened, Dr. Bass asked us about the schools there in Lowndes and Montgomery, and we saw Robert E. Lee High School, you know. And so what did our activist students do in 2020? I believe it was in March, Dr. Briggs. Well, they fought to have the Confederate names overturned from the high schools. It went all the way to the legislature there, the council, and it was passed. Now, from my understanding, Dr. Briggs, it's going to be about 6 months, or if not longer, before the name is changed from Jeff Davis High School and Robert E. Lee High School there. And I believe that vote passed 6-1 for Jeff Davis and Robert E. Lee. But they also got Sidney Lanier High School passed as well to be changed, and that vote was 5-2. And we also see the interns for the Equal Justice Initiative. Their interns there have been very active in the community, but also we know that Black Lives Matter there in Montgomery has been very active, and a host of many other youth organizations that are the descendants of Grandmama and Big Mama and them in the Lowndes County, Bloody Lowndes area, and the capital there in Montgomery, Alabama. And so from 1960 to 2020, we see the fight is still taking place.
This has been absolutely overwhelming and certainly awesome. I'm going to turn it over to our facilitator, Dr. Bass, and then I'll follow with my last comments to summarize and put it in perspective. Dr. Bass?
I thought that it was incredible, as always, Professor Evans. I mean, no one does history like you do. And for all of us who grew up without getting an adequate history lesson, thank you. Thank you for teaching us something that school should have taught us a long time ago. So for those of you who are listening and watching, I hope that you took notes. You can always go back and rewatch this and take more notes so you can really get a better sense of what Professor Evans laid out today. Dr. White.
And I'm excited, and I'm just going to add Mr. Evans, the visuals that you provided, other than that unnecessary, inhuman side comment that Dr. Briggs made with regard to my wonderful transformation from 2018 to 2020 in the time of the COVID. Your visuals were absolutely exceptional. And again, for our young people, those of you who are in high school, for our young people, those of you who are finishing up their first year in college, I'm telling you, there is no secret. You are having a conversation with college professors, and what we're telling you right now, when you do what Professor Evans just did and bring the history to life, you're putting your paper and your work in context. It's no secret. That's the thing that we love. Why? Because we know you've done your research. And so there's nothing more exciting and nothing greater than what we've witnessed here today. I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Briggs, and then following that, we're going to give a hint about a historic event that is taking place the same time on next week that's going to get us out of our seats, and that's going to cause that Morehouse man, Mr. Evans, to cover his screen, because we are going to follow this, share about a history-making moment. So, Dr. Briggs, we'll let you close out first, and then we'll finish it off.
You know, two things that I would have sworn that I hated in K-12 and even perhaps in undergrad and grad school, and that is history and data. Two things that I love having worked for Gear Up Alabama: history and data. And it's one of those things you either love it or you hate it. But you know, absolutely, when you open your heart and your mind, and when you open the books, and now with the internet and the computer, when you open it up, the whole world is right here. And when you have a storyteller like Doug Evans, when you have a pastor like a Gary White and the isms that comes out of his mouth, when you have a Christopher Bass who can weave it all together and make it make sense in current context and application, you can't help but to love history. And this has been another amazing tour. Gentlemen, you know, we couldn't have done it better if we were on the bus, because we would have been bumping. We would have been a little, you know, stirred up by now. 2-3 hours later, we would have still been full with whatever home cooked meal somebody prepared for us. So right here in our own living rooms, in our own offices, we have the pleasure of learning. And I'm grateful to you three brilliant and passionate souls for bringing it to us each week. And yeah, so, I mean, there is this thing that's happening tomorrow. It ain't next week. So what was that you were about to say exactly? My head was itching. I didn't.
So on next week, I mean, on tomorrow at 1 o'clock, that's 12 Central, the Black Belt Black History College Tour will move to the greatest institution created under the canopy of heaven. We will be talking about the Clark Atlanta University. Atlanta University formed in 1865. Clark College formed in 1868. And so when we get ready to talk about this history and recognize the historic significance of this outstanding institution, you all are going to be captivated, and we expect the phones for registration to blow off the hook. Dr. Bass, tell me about the college students that we have coming forward to talk about this great institution called Clark Atlanta University.
Well, we have a treat in store for you all tomorrow. We have one sophomore, we have one junior, and we have two seniors, including the second ever Mr. Clark Atlanta University. We have student orientation guides. They have a whole plethora of different positions that they hold on campus, but they're not boring. They're exciting young people, and they're really ready and excited to share with you the wonder that is the Clark Atlanta University, a proud member of the Atlanta University Center. So we're excited. The students are ready, and we'll see you tomorrow.
1865, 1869. In a personal plug, I'm going to tell you, 1920, when the first African-American School of Social Work was founded, the Atlanta School of Social Work, in which we're celebrating our 100th anniversary of the souls of great teens of old, promoting education across the nation. We're excited about the history that you all are going to experience tomorrow. The White Bass Livecast, the Black College Tour, stopping at the Clark Atlanta University. So everybody jump on, tell everyone that Clark Atlanta University is coming live. Why? Because you're surrounded by some alums right now, a two-time proud alum of Clark Atlanta University. 1994, 2007. Dr. Briggs?
Third generation, great-grandmother, grandmother, me and the husband. And the son is up next, making it 4. Let's go.
Dr. Bass.
First class, 1988, when Clark College and Atlanta University formed. I was among the first class, but I didn't come alone. I brought my twin brother with me. We'll see you tomorrow.
History in the making. You all take care. God bless. Until we meet each other again, continue to carry the history with you. Thank you all very much.